All right, I'm going to start. Even if you keep talking, I'm going to start. So welcome. My name is Dillon, and I'm here to introduce Intermediate 5, the second year that I'm running the unit. So last year, I concluded this intro presentation with the terms visionary, everyday, experimental, and architecture. And these terms are still the foundation of the unit. And this year, we will add the term technology. Therefore, Intermediate 5 aims to be a collective group of optimistic thinkers that are socially conscious. Our projects aim to be visionary proposals that are rooted and based in the everyday happenings of the city. And they are generated by social objectives. The intention here is that the projects resonate with a larger audience, the general public, while also challenging the architectural status quo and worn-out establishments. This leads to our first referent of the unit, Richard Buckminster Fuller. Fuller's collection of work represents a lifelong experiment in which everything that came into his path was to be questioned, not accepting the conventional and redesigned for the benefit of society. These included, but are not limited to, a self-sufficient bathroom unit, a single-family aluminum home, as seen here in the Wichita House, automobiles, as seen here in the Dymaxion car, flying auto airplanes with inflatable wings, housing towers delivered by Zeppelins, geodesic domes that cover Midtown Manhattan, and a new method for drawing the map of the world, as seen here in How to Assemble the Globe, and Buckminster Fuller on the right following the steps. From everyday objects to housing to maps, from the scale of the object to the scale of Earth and space, these projects all circulate around the central theme of transport, telecommunication, and living. These themes of Fuller influence many architects all over the world, especially a young Cedric Price, another individual that we will gain inspiration from throughout the year. His body of work includes a mobile architecture school, as seen here by the Polyarch AA bus tour, hard hat turbans for the Sikh community, so they can continue wearing their turbans while also being protected. A bird aviary, seen here, the Snowden Aviary along Regent's Canal in London Zoo, 24-hour homes, a think belt, a fun palace, and an interactive center. This collection of Price and Fuller projects are representative of Fuller's famous statement. Sorry, this is the Fun Palace here. These are representative of Fuller's famous statement that people should think things out fresh and not just accept conventional terms and the conventional way of doing things. What this quote calls for is for architects to find a new way of working. But not only that, we also need to challenge the terminology that we use. Buckminster Fuller saw himself as a wordsmith. It's claimed, I'm not 100% sure this is true, that he came up with the word debunk. He coined this term to point out the flaws in the conventional and traditional architecture that his housing proposals were intended to stand in contrast to. In addition, he came up with the word Dymaxion. He pieced together this word by a bunch of different words that he used over time, dynamic, maximum, ion, max, to come up with the idea of Dymaxion. It's also a play on words in that it's a noun and a verb to, of course, emphasize the ideas of motion. This challenge of terminology can be seen in Pottery's Think Belt by Price as well. For the Pottery's Think Belt project, Price and his design team went to great lengths to think about what normally would be termed housing or classrooms or school by introducing new terms for their spaces in their design brief. Housing became crate, sprawl, battery, capsule. School became a think belt. The model that Fuller and Price have left us is that we are to challenge the conventional model such as house and school, then we also need to challenge and rethink the terminology that we're using. In order to follow this ethos, Inter 5 will once again discard the architectural brief and the constraints such as type, program, and site that come with it. In addition to this, we will discard the conventional architectural precedent. Returning to the 60s is not for nostalgia's sake, or to repeat what Fuller and Price or any of their contemporaries did. Quoting John Lennon in one of his last interviews, the thing the 60s did was to show us the possibilities and the responsibilities that we all had. It wasn't the answer. It was just a glimpse of the possibility. The architects of the 60s proposed models for their time, based on the technologies at their disposal and with a sense of optimism and purpose. We will take with us this optimism and their belief in architecture, but we are from a different time with different social objectives and more advanced technologies. We need not repeat their models, but to make new ones. The reason for the rejection of the brief and the precedent is so that we can create a new set of constraints to work from that are socially driven. For the precedent standpoint, we will collect materials, not from architectural books, but from our observations and documentation of everyday life and movement in the city. For this, we turn our attention to our other main referent, the Oulipo Group and Georges Perec. Seen here, Georges Perec is at the head of the table with the crazy hair, and those are the rest of the Oulipo members. Georges Perec set a series of urban explorations to document the everyday through constraint-based projects. Oulipo, a group of French thinkers, writers, and mathematicians, founded in 1960, their Oulipo manifesto openly questioned why writers and artists and mathematicians adhered to old tricks of the trade while refusing to explore new potentials, not much different than Fuller's statements. Our collection and observation of the city will be focused on two terms, living and mobility, the way we inhabit the city and how we are transported or move around our city. In term one, we will take on Oulipo's terminology, anoulipism, which is for analysis, and begin to infiltrate the city of London and start our collection, observations, and obsessions. We will do this with 4 parallel ingredients that will run side by side. Obsessions of the everyday, exploration of Regent's Canal, an investigation and dissection of Life a User's Manual, and finally, an investigation of London transport systems. The first ingredient are everyday obsessions. In Perec's famous text, Approaches to What, he questions, how should we take into account of, question, describe what happens every day and recurs every day? The banal, the quotidien, the obvious, the common, the ordinary, the infraordinary, the background noise, and the habitual. These are a set of drawings that will inspire us by Jiro Kon. He's a Japanese architect working quite a while before Perec in the 20s. And this is basically him going out and documenting people sleeping in the streets, their clothes, their positions, and their locations within the street on the left. There's a whole series of these drawings. He has drawings of people within trains as well, which become quite influential to us. So this contrast of the idea of the infraordinary or the everyday is in contrast to the thirst of society for the extraordinary, the front page headline, the plane crash, and the disaster. And this really confounded Perec. So he set out 2 projects, one called Lou, which translates to spaces, and also an attempt to exhaust a place in Paris. So he set out trying just to document flatly what he saw. So taking this on board, each student will choose 2 obsessions, 1, an action, and 2, an object. This is an example possibly of both. With Sophie Call and her project's Days Under the Letter. This happens to be W. She did other letters as well. But everything she did was predicated on the first word starting with W. So when she got, for example, if she were to get on a train in London, she might go to Waterloo. All the books that are on that table start with the letter W. She's drinking Johnny Walker Red, and so forth. So she did this through the many letters of the alphabet. So objects and sort of action and movement. But for the students, action can be how many people walk through a square, cross a bridge, talk on a mobile, cycle, or human actions such as sneezing, laughing, or crying. And these aren't, the students themselves will come up with the topic, not myself. In terms of objects, we can look at Emily Weber's project, the shop front project. And objects we can look at are bicycles, canal boats, the collections of typologies, street signs, storefronts, building facades, vehicles, natural elements. A nice aspect about this are the constraints that Emily uses within the project itself. She can only do shops on high streets. They cannot be chain shops. And in addition, no automobiles, no people in front of the photograph. So she has to sit and wait until the space clears. And she has a whole website documenting these around London. So as a unit, we will collectively do this. Each student will have their own obsessions. And by the end, we'll have a collective sort of grouping of all these obsessions in a unit book. Once you find your obsession, you will collect the data through rigorous repetition and documentation towards exhaustion. The output will be detective-like logbooks with hand sketches, note-taking, photographs, video, and audio. To supplement this, we'll have James Ward come give a talk. He's an author, as well as the head of something called the Boring Conference, where he collects people like Emily to give talks, who document everyday elements of the city. And also Nick Hunt, who is an author who just has a book come out called Walking the Woods and the Water, where he followed Patrick Leigh Farmer's journey from Holland to Turkey. He walked all the way from Holland to Turkey and documented his experience. Moving on to the canal and the ingredient 2, our explorations as well as our urban proposals, our interventions, our architectural designs will all be threaded along Regent's Canal. We will walk the canal and document it as a group, and then you will do it individually as well. And then we also take a boat trip along the canal from Paddington Basin to Limehouse Basin. It's a stretch of 8.6 miles. The canal has a long history of transport, not only as you see here, canal boats, which are now coming back into popularity, but also it was bought by transport companies about 3 times to turn into train tracks, but it keeps being rejected by the council. So we will highlight the mobility systems that intersect the canal and the everyday activities around the canal. Students will eventually hone in on one specific area where they will propose their architectural design intervention along the canal. I don't give prescribed sites at all. We don't even use the word site in the unit. So I'll give you criteria for selection of where you're going to place your intervention. 1 is the canal. There'll be 4 of these. 1 is the canal, which is a given. 2 is a transport system. 3 is an existing building. And 4 is a public space. Your location will have 3 of those. The 4th one will have to be designed into the project. For example, if you have the canal, the transport system, and the existing building, then you will have to design a public space and also in relation to rethinking and reconsidering the other 3 in relation to it. Along our canal explorations, you'll be asked to look for found objects, brochures, posters, flyers, and urban artifacts. We will go to the London Canal Museum for research, and we will also be given a talk by an author named Lee Rourke, who has a book simply called The Canal. For our 3rd ingredient, I'm sorry, these are historical pictures of the canal and Islington's tunnel. A more recent image of one of the tunnels. And also an even more recent image of a party in one of the basins, which got quite out of hand and about 100 people were arrested. So hopefully we have a party on the canal, but we don't get arrested. For Life of Users Manual, which is an image that represents the book itself, done by a photographic artist. But Perec basically states with his intention of the book is that I prefer books in which characters are described by their actions, their gestures, and their surroundings. At the heart of this book, Perec's constraint-based novel, Life a User's Manual, is the description of people moving around and through spaces involved in everyday activities, a model of how to describe people and things in space. Students will select 4 chapters from this book, dissect it, analyze it, and then graphically represent the narrative. The graphic method will then be used as a technique to explain the different types of living and mobility within your own design proposals. I'll also give a talk of the constraint-based system that Perec used as a writing machine to create this novel. The 4th ingredient is the transport systems. This is an image of Tottenham Court Road, which we all know very well. The London Underground, the first of its kind in the world, the double-decker buses, the black cab, have all become icons in the City of London. And transport systems obviously equal motion. They circulate us around our cities. Students will be asked to select one of 3 transport systems. Below grade, the Underground or Crossrail. On grade, the London buses. And above grade, the London Overground, including the DLR. Collectively, as a group, we will analyze these systems, draw them, and from an individual standpoint, you will augment the systems within your design proposals. As part of TS for 3rd years, the starting point for the TS projects will be the transport systems and looking at how we can potentially augment them. It's only a starting point, and the TS will evolve along with the project itself. We use the TS as a way to further develop the projects. It is not a separate project in Intermediate 5. It worked quite well last year in terms of furthering the projects in terms of its details, so we will continue doing that, but we will start with the transport systems. Students will also be looked at the overlapping systems, pedestrian traffic, bicycle traffic, vehicular traffic, as a way to see how they integrate together. The London Underground system and transport systems has a long history of sort of living and mobility. Seeing here children living in the Underground during the war, and many more people living in the Tube during the bombings at Aldwych. So these sorts of images are quite striking and show a historical relationship between living and mobility in the city. Here's more recent ones where during a protest, individuals took pants off and traveled to work on the Tube. And likewise, not so far off, about 2008, 2009, the London Tube was actually a public space. So people partied within the Tube. Now it's no longer a public space, but along the Circle Line, there were quite a few parties, and there were all a set of rules that went along with it. I had a great group of students last year. Everyone got along really well, very sincere, very bright students. It was an enjoyable year. I had this slide up last year. I said that I was hoping that someone would throw a party like this on the Tube, and no one did. So hoping this year someone who is in the unit will take on that challenge, because it looks like a lot of fun. The importance of transport for me has to do with that the world, as Fuller says, is constantly in motion. As part of this exploration in the transport, we will go to the London Transport Museum, and we'll also go to Heatherwick's office and have a talk about the fabrication of the new Route Master, as well as some of their other projects, such as the bridge over the Thames that deals with transport. So, as Fuller states, it is certainly to my philosophy that everything in the universe is constantly in motion, atomically, if not visibly. So with this, taking this on board, we will venture off onto our unit trip at the beginning of term 2. This will be in conjunction with an earlier trip that we will take in Paris during middle part of term 1, where we will sort of go to the city where Oulipo originated, but we'll also see the Paris metro system, and we'll also go to Palais de Tokyo and the Frac Center in Orleans, which is about an hour outside, that has an amazing collection of architectural models and drawings. So with that on board, play a clip from the Darjeeling Limited by Wes Anderson. We will not be going to India, but we will be going to Europe. And the importance of this film, other than the fact that I quite like that the young actor here, Adrian Brody, runs past the old actor, Bill Murray, and leaves him on the platform. So, the importance of this movie for me is that they're in perpetual motion. They're either on trains, on foot, they're never stationary. Even when they are stationary, the vehicle that they're on is moving. We will do the same thing through Europe. We will go by ferry to Denmark, traverse over to Copenhagen, take the boats to mainland Europe, down through Berlin, then to Vienna to see their iconic red street cars. This trip will actually be a project for us. We will document what we see out of train cars. We will sleep in train cars. We'll look at the auxiliary buildings that the trains go through. This is a song by the Kings. A couple quotes from this film. The character Owen Wilson plays. He says, I think we have to make a change, a life-changing, we need to make this a life-changing experience. And I think we need it. He says, I want us to completely open and say yes to everything, even if it's shocking and painful. Mace won't be allowed on the trip. We'll use this unit trip as an inspiration, seeing multiple transport systems to inspire our design proposals that will take place in term 2. In term 2, we will focus on the architectural proposal and at the building scale. We will rethink and rejuvenate London. This is Fuller's geometric dome on Midtown Manhattan. He says of the buildings of Manhattan that they are but crops in a farm that needed to be rotated, turned over, plowed under, and the elements reused and replanted, recycled into a new crop. We will take this to London. Working at the scale of the building, and down to its details. To show you some projects from the unit last year, this is Ed Rawls' project, which was a construction farm inspired by 3D printing technologies. On the right is a diagram of the system, which turned corn and potatoes into crops for building components. And on the left are a series of characters within the system that were, through the variation of 3D printing, were allowed to construct their own nodes. So we have a maker, a shopkeeper, a farmer who were allowed to make their own nodes and structures for their use. So it put the idea of fabrication back into the hands of the individual. You see we're working at details and diagrams, but we also zoom out to the scale of the city. This project was located on a viaduct system in Brixton. A few of which are underused or not used at all. But then Ed seen to map these out through rest of London. And as you know, so many of the undersides of these viaducts are being used for rock climbing, bars, restaurants, and so forth. So he tacked on to this current trend within the city. This is Will Pelham's project. On the left, you see a series of A4 drawings and diagrams and images that were his inspiration. Throughout the year, I will give you constraints, A4 squares, A1 squares, that you then interpret and make your own, which Will has done here. These are all seen as individual fragments, so you can take each square and read it as is and learn something from it, but collectively they tell a much larger story. His project infiltrated the tube and the Crossrail, and this is a section through Bedford Square showing that. And again, a section, a larger zoomed out section, as well as the plans where he mapped out where you would go down. He created another layer within the city, a living layer underneath, as a commentary to being pushed out to the suburbs. This allowed many people to live in central London at lower costs. This is James' project, which is a commentary and a response to Tesco's and the supermarket models that are dominating the city and chains. This is a project where he looked on the left through TS at easy ways to fabricate carts, mobile carts through the city. He sat at bus stops and documented all these different food vehicles that you see carrying around delivery food within the city. And he basically started to map out a mobile market on the bus systems. This shows intersections of different buses on the right carrying food. And this is a diagram of the project. You can see the red letters coming down the left, 1538 254. Each one of these buses carried a specific type of food, cheese, fish, meat, on the bus. And when they converged at stops, they would become sort of markets at the public space, which James turned the bus stops into public spaces. But this went much farther outside of the city and also to the bus depots. And so we're constantly going through three scales of the detail, the city and the building itself. And finally, one last project. This is by Zippo Zoo. It started out as an interest in speed and the inefficiency of existing train stations, King's Cross and St. Pancras, and turned into a real interest in the maglev speed, the maglev trains and their speed. And this is an interior shot on the right of trains coming through the station, people wearing Google glasses to get information, and et cetera. And then on the left, he starts to think about the cultural ramifications of this project. The fact that you can go from New York to London in 3 hours, Beijing to London in 4.5 hours, Los Angeles to San Francisco in 45 minutes, and started to think about what that meant for time zone change, temperature change, and the effect on someone sort of socially and psychologically. On the right, as you can see, I put these two together because this is at the scale of the city, or actually the world. On the left and on the right, he's actually reconfiguring and rethinking the train seat itself. So we work, like I said, on multiple scales, and this is an example of that. And it comes from an idea from Fuller of think global, act local. So this marriage of everyday objects and big visionary proposals is an interest of mine, dating back to when I was sort of at your point, at second and third year, when I came across a book by Moshe Safdie called For Everyone a Garden, where it struck me quite powerfully about how he was not interested in architectural jargon whatsoever. He was more interested in the social objectives of building. And it had a very big impact on me. And this was his project, Habitat 67, which some of you probably know. And I was lucky enough to work for Moshe for about 6 or 7 years. And I worked on projects in India, Massachusetts, and the States, Canada as well. And this project in 67 was right near Buckminster Fuller's dome as well. And Moshe became friends with Fuller. And Moshe once called Fuller his political hero. And I asked Moshe about that, and he said the reason is because he actually saw architecture as a means to reach the masses. So after, and this became quite important to me, after I worked for Moshe, I came here to the AA and I did my master's in histories and theories. And now I teach in the history and theory department in undergraduate and third year in the diploma school, and I also am a part of the DRL staff. as the program coordinator. So I'm here full-time as well, so you'll see me around quite a bit. So going back to our projects in a sense, and term 3, once we worked on the scale of the building, we will then go back and understand our projects at the scale of the city and beyond. And we will understand their ramifications and their consequences, and we will look at portfolio development. But there is a consequence of looking at big visionary proposals, and that's in some cases, it comes across as utopian. Mark Wigley, and I conclude with this, Mark Wigley referred to this image of Buckminster Fuller where his geodesic domes are floating in the sky, where he says this image gives a sense of realism to the project, making the translucent dome appear more than an image, more than a fantasy. They suspend the viewer between fantasy and reality, leaving the sense of fantasy realized. And Antoine Picon also states, in current usage, the term utopian generally bears connotations of unreality, yet Fuller's utopian vision was mightily real. Seeing himself as much as a man of action as ideas, he insisted on the feasibility of even his most ambitious propositions. This was achieved by Fuller's embrace of the totality of everyday objects. Fuller's Dymaxion house, bathroom, and car constituted so many elements of a total environment thought out to its smallest details. So collectively, the tutor and students will take Fuller's lead and coupled with the implementation of new but existing technologies beyond the architectural profession, the objective of intermediate 5 projects is to construct visionary architectural interventions for an almost future that resonate in the present while optimistically altering our perceptions of everyday life. Thank you.